I do and I've been engaged in for some time is the both in my time at EBCLC and now my time at the ACLU. Uh, we've done a lot of work through two different coalitions, the Back on the Road Coalition and the Debt Free Justice California Coalition. The Back on the Road Coalition did a lot of work around driver's license suspensions and the debt that comes from that. And the Debt Free Justice Coalition has done a lot of work around court-ordered debt. Last year, our bill that ended up being a 2-year trailer bill ended up being passed, building on the local work that we had done in Alameda County, started in Contra Costa County in San Francisco, getting rid of probation supervision fees, public defender representation fees, et cetera. And so the statewide bill ended up getting rid of all those things across the state, which is estimated to be approximately $16 billion worth of court order debt that is being relieved from people. And so I bring those two things up because in some ways, the Racial Justice Act allows for utilizing the data and the knowledge that we already know, both statistically and anecdotally. So in the driver's license suspension realm, for example, all the studies that have been done and reports that have been issued by my colleagues in the Back on the Road Coalition show that essentially if you are poor, Black, and brown, you can sort of put that on a map and throw a dart. And where there are poor people, Black people, and brown people, there's going to be higher concentrations of driver's license suspensions, for example. And because so much of the contact between Black communities, brown communities, and the police come from traffic stops, right? And those traffic stops end up effectuating a lot of some of the initial charging. It will be, I think, helpful to be able to sort of put together the statistical data for the traffic stops themselves and how those things end up resulting in charges, and then those charges end up resulting in either charges that are disproportionate given race and ethnicity, and sentencing that ends up being disproportionate. When I was a public defender in Contra Costa County, the initial thing you do when you get a case is you read it and then you end up filing motions to suppress, and the vast majority of those motions end up being from traffic stops, right? Officer stopping someone because they're going over the speed limit, and then getting into the car and finding something, right? And I think for at least, I think the first report around driving while Black was produced by the ACLU in like the 80s. And everywhere that a study has been duplicated in terms of driving while Black, you've seen that Black folks disproportionately are impacted by these traffic stops and driver's license suspension. And those things end up being on-ramps to the criminal justice system. And so I am hopeful that it will allow for the connection between sort of these other disparities that we see, like being in a car and how being in a car can result in entanglement in the criminal justice system. And then things that we see where the offers that you get to resolve your case, as Jane was talking about, ends up being different depending upon who your client is, who the DA is, et cetera. So I'm interested to see what that looks like.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rolanda, can you give us your perspective of how the Racial Justice Act is going to impact you, and perhaps from your perspective as a former DA, talk about it?
Well, there's two ways I'd like to answer this question. One, as an African American prosecutor, I think that I and many others like me always tried to work on the sides of justice. So the biggest thing is we need to make sure that our district attorney's offices fully reflect our communities. Because when they do so, as a DA, when you receive that case, that's a lot of power. And you have an opportunity to look at that case right from that police report and make a determination whether or not charges will be filed and whether or not you think it was a just stop or a good case or not a good case, or a good search or not a good search. And having individuals in the office that come from the community and reflect the community is going to act better in terms of whether or not there's bias, whether conscious or unconscious. And I'm going to talk about that later in terms of what I believe around conscious and unconscious bias. The other thing about the new act is you have to look at the cost. And I know everybody hates to talk about that, But the reality is that it can bring a lot of profound cost, and there's no money in this bill to take care of that, especially for smaller DA's offices that have to pull a lot of records, go back. You also don't know how far back in time you're gonna have to go, how far afield it may be. Those are all things I think that can be worked out as time goes on. But certainly they cause a lot of fear in DA's offices when they think about, oh my God, because I worked on the, having to pull these kind of records in the past Public Records Act, and it can be quite involved. But I do believe that times are changing. They're always changing. We all saw what happened this summer in terms of people getting more involved and understanding what needs to be done around racial justice. And so I am hopeful that we will be able to work these things out and that we will in fact be able to achieve justice for everyone in our community.
Could you explain the need to look at older files, because the act is prospective, so it applies to cases after January 1st.
Yes. Well, but if the person, I'm sure the defendant makes a request and says, this happened to me, you're going to have to look back and see, is there some kind of systemic racism that was involved in the charge in this case? And it's got to go beyond January 1st of 2021. At least that would be my understanding. You'd have to look back.
For the current case, you'd have to look at the past actions. Thank you.
I can address that, actually, just having done any trainings.
And again, speak close to the camera or close to the mic.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me make sure my volume's up here. Okay, I can address that. Essentially, the Racial Justice Act provides that something called a motion for relevant data. And essentially what it means is that, let's say that you're trying to prove, there's different ways to prove the racial claim under the Racial Justice Act. But let's say, for example, just to take a quick one, that you're trying to prove that your client, my client, was sentenced, as a Black man, was sentenced more harshly than clients similarly situated who were not Black. Then I would need to gather statistical data from the county that I'm in to show those statistics. So I would need to show data that, you know, Joe Blow and Jim Green, sorry, there's somebody Green in here, Mr. Green, sorry, Jim Green, you know, were sentenced to X, and now my client is sentenced to Y.
Right.
And so that's going to require a motion to the district attorney's office and for them to provide that data of how people were sentenced in that frame.
Thank you. So what specifically, and I'll just make this a question to the entire panel, what specifically will change with the implementation of the act?
Well,
go ahead.
I think a lot of things will probably change. I think probably in the more serious cases, you're going to really have to examine exactly what's going on, how it's going on, how this case was charged. And the defendant has to be able to show that, in fact, there was some racial disparity going on there around their ethnicity and background. And so it is going to be, to me, I don't think it would be anything new, because I used to do that because of the person that I am and the way that I was trained. But let's be realistic here. That's not everybody. And I think this now makes sure that everybody that's involved in this process has to do this examination and make sure that what they're doing is good across the board for everyone and does not include bias. And bias is something that we have to work with all the time in the justice system. It's very nebulous, it's tough, but it's something we have to do if we want to achieve justice.
I think
you had mentioned, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Brandon.
I was just going to say, you know, I think for me, the question really is, how is the Racial Justice Act going to play with the other reforms that were passed? So the Right to a Jury of Your Peers Act, because, you know, obviously we're not talking about Batson Wheeler here, but like it's related, right? Like the this, and as well as the like the idea that you have a trial by your peers made of people from your community, right? Like as a general matter in California was not really happening. Black folks are being excluded from juries at extremely high rates, right? And for me, there'll be a question because, you know, part of the access during the trial, whether or not there was purposeful language directed at the defendant, that there was use of racially discriminatory language, whether or not an attorney, judge, or law enforcement officer exhibited racial bias or animus. And I think there's going to be a question of what that animus looks like, because we already know that there's racial bias and racial animus in the California criminal justice system. There's also a question to me of how the statistics are going to work, because again, we already know that there's statistical evidence that there is this bias that exists. I think because it is perspective, I think how the existing statistical evidence that we have is going to be utilized moving forward, I think is one of the questions for me. You know, I remember I was in trial on a domestic violence case, and you know, the little DA attempted to have my like big Black client stand up to like show the difference relative to his size to her, right? Which to me, you know, is something that would be implicated in terms of racial bias or animus, but it's a question of whether or not that would be right. You know, I think the obvious visual of those things, right? A little white woman, right, having a bigger Black man stand up in a case where he's accused of battering someone would fit within this particular category of things that we can try to speak to. But I don't necessarily know if that is clear. Like, how is the data that I already mentioned around traffic stops and traffic enforcement that leads into on-ramps of the criminal justice system going to be utilized and applied in terms of how cases are being charged, the frequency with which they're being charged, who's disproportionately being charged, et cetera, are questions that, you know, as I said, the devil's in the details. And so I think it has a lot of opportunity to change a lot of things based upon what we already know and collect further information, but I wonder if it'll be limited, and I'm not sure that we know that yet.
Well, as to jury selection, I just want to say I'm always the DA's first peremptory, always. Anyway, Jane, were you going to say something?
Yeah, so for me, the thing that I hope is going to change, the biggest thing is that everyone in the courtroom begins to say out loud race, that they are willing to talk about race. We all know that race pervades every single part of our justice system. And sometimes I hesitate to call it that. That's why I stumbled a bit, quite frankly. It pervades from, you know, what neighborhoods police decide to patrol, all the way up through charging decisions, et cetera, as we talked about. And we really are going to need district attorneys willing to examine their own conscious and unconscious bias and be willing to do that. We need judges who are going to be willing to be courageous enough when they see a claim that has merit to grant it. And we need defense attorneys who aren't scared to call to name it and to bring these claims. And for all of those different organizations, wherever people may work, we need leaders who set the expectation that this is the right thing to do, that we need to affirm the language in the statute, which says, you know, we will not tolerate racial injustice and bias in our system any longer. But I agree with Brandon that until the devil is in the details, but it really is about people being committed to the nature of the statute, the intent of the spirit of the statute.
Right.
Yes, Rolanda, please.
Yeah, and I think I agree with Jane that really it is, and Brandon as well. It is in the details. but it's also in the examination in these offices about really what are we about, what are we doing, what kind of training are we going to do to get people to start thinking about these issues, looking at these issues, and questioning their conscious and or unconscious bias. And Marjolaine, you mentioned about being, kicked off a jury. I've been kicked off of plenty of them, certainly for many reasons. But also as a prosecutor, I've had jurors, African-American jurors, kicked off my jury, and actually had a defense attorney tell me, well, of course I had to get rid of that woman because she looked at you with such pride in her eyes. So let me tell you, bias goes across many levels, and that is one thing, hopefully, that we will start looking at across the board. And again, I cannot emphasize enough, we really must make sure that all of our offices represent our communities. That, I think, is the first step.
Well,
Because we have people that are in these offices that look like the communities out there. We're going to start asking the right questions and making the right changes. And that goes not just for the DA's office, not just for the public defender's offices, but for our judges as well. I'm the oldest one on this panel. So I started out at a time where we didn't even have enough racial inclusion in our public defender's offices. So we have certainly come a long way.
well, what are some of the, and again, this is for any of you to answer, but what are some of the potential limitations you see with the RJA?
So one big issue that I see coming up is that, as it's been, I think in the chat, there's some conversation around the data collection. And, as I was saying, this creates, the Racial Justice Act creates this motion for relevant data. It's not quite a discovery statute. So to be clear about that, but the best analogy would be similar to discovery. And as a public defender, I can say there are often challenges and fights among attorneys, public defenders, and district attorneys around discovery issues. And I think that there's going to be, for those offices that are resistant to the implementation of the Racial Justice Act and what it means, there's going to be pushback in those areas of what they need to provide. And even judges, to the degree that they think, like in the example that Brandon gave, for example, about his client standing up, I could see a judge saying, well, this is a domestic violence case. This is about, certainly the jury can look at your client to determine whether or not your client might have been more likely to cause force upon this person, something along those lines. And Brandon, of course, would be making the argument, this plays into stereotypes, there's a subtext here, there's coded language being used, all the things that you're talking about in the statute. And so there's going to be, I think there's going to be a lot of issues around, as Brandon said, kind of what's what, and what do you call things, what qualifies as animus, what qualifies as bias, what qualifies as intentional, unintentional, what happened out of court, because there is a provision to, the unique thing about the statute is it covers actions toward the defendant outside of court, not just in court. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion around that. And so, my hope is, again, is that, at the very base of this, to me, is, the idea of, course, examining bias, but it's also about opening the door for it to become natural to talk about race. People do not like to talk about race in the courtroom. And it doesn't matter whether they are Black, brown, white, yellow, purple. It's just a thing out there. And, I work in Alameda County, which is, a county which I would say there's a lot more diversity in the district attorney's office, all those different things. And it's still a challenge because it just makes everyone uncomfortable. And so the biggest issue is pushing through that and then dealing with all the different things. And then the last thing I would say is there just recently was a case where someone raised the Racial Justice Act issue and in my office, and there was a statement of, you're trying to inject race into this case. And I have to say that I personally believe that is a commonly held sentiment, that, the facts are the facts, race has nothing to do with them. And so that's why I keep going back to this notion that we have to, that the statute is not about, it's not personal to you, me, or anybody else. And we have to be willing to speak the truth out loud about what's happening on. We can disagree with the truth is, but we need to be addressing the issue and having the debate.
It's like the elephant in the room, right?
Right.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think also, this would really go towards sentencing too, because that was a lot of the problems that I saw. The facts may be the facts, but when the case is over, adjudicated, the jury's made a decision, now all of a sudden the sentence is way out of whack for that person of color as opposed to that person who was white. That's a big problem as well, and that has to be looked at. It may not be a question of race in terms of how the facts laid out, but it certainly could be a question of race as to how this person eventually is sentenced. And that's something that I think the Racial Justice Act is really trying to look at as well. And that caused me a lot of concern as a DA to make sure that when sentences were handed out, they were appropriate across the board. For example, I had a case of an African-American student that stole a laptop. Facts are, he stole a laptop. They wanted him, charged with a felony. Judge wanted to send him away to prison for many years. But I had another case of a white student who stole many laptops, but he came from a rich background, no prior case of any sort, and the judge was talking about probation. So bottom line, we have to also remember around sentencing. The other problems I think we haven't talked about is Article 6, Section 13 of the California Constitution. And I think a lot of DA's offices may be wanting to bring that up because this act doesn't require any real showing of prejudice, and legal experts may expect that this lack of requirement will be challenged by this Article 6. And you may want to look at that. I don't want to read everything word for word for you, even though I've written it down here word for word. But in the end, the court has to decide that the error complained of has resulted in a miscarriage of justice. And again, that's a huge burden. So we may have all the tools, we may have all the ideas, but it's still going to lay in that court's lap as to whether or not this was a true miscarriage of justice. And I can see some DA's offices really fighting back using this Article 6, Section 13.
Thank you. Brandon, you were about to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of the crux of the issue for me. I mean, last night and the night before, related to something outside of my job at the ACLU, but I'm also a contributing scholar in the Center for Race and Economic Justice at Hastings, and I was doing some reading around a lot of the different Supreme Court cases for around criminal procedure, everything from like the cases that had to decide whether or not it is appropriate after the passage of the 14th Amendment to exclude all Black jurors, and then the cases after that about unanimous juries or non-unanimous juries in Oregon and Louisiana, and like all of these cases, all the way up to the cases preceding like Batson Willard, for example, like had a lot of different statistical data and information. There's always this push-pull between how people prove what their lived experiences are, right? So it's always like, well, what is the data to back that thing up? And then in the concurrence from in the Batson case, it was said that we should just get rid of peremptory challenges altogether because we already know how they've played out for Black folks. And I just say that to say that like part of, I think, my caution is not only around the data. So I'm not sure. I mean, in my work, I have often had to issue Public Records Act requests, and often the response is, well, we either don't have the proper mechanisms to generate the data, or we can generate the data, but you're going to have to spend $20,000 for us to write a program to be able to do it. And that sort of thing, right? So you can't actually get the data to prove the thing that you know from lived experience is true, right? And then there's this other thing I think that this isn't necessarily getting at, but around like who is represented in the judiciary, right? Because ultimately, those are the folks that are going to be making the findings as to whether or not the arguments that you are making are valid or statistically significant enough. You know, I remember, you know, another case. It was a anonymous 911 caller, and you know they said there were some kids walking down the street who had a gun. Nobody saw them brandish one or anything. The cops pulled my client and friends over, and you know, it resulted in charges. And I remember in the motion to suppress, I was saying to the judge, well, if a anonymous 911 caller said there, admittedly the judge was a short white woman, and I said if the 911 caller said, you know, there was a short white woman walking down the street who has a gun, no real description of her, like would the same thing have happened, right? Likely wouldn't have happened, because the short white woman who nobody actually saw brandishing a gun wouldn't be seen as dangerous, right? And I just say that to say that, like, when I was arguing this in court before this judge whose lived experience was very different than mine, having actually been in handcuffs, had cops pull guns on me, etc., that like her analysis of bias and prejudice is going to be very different than mine. And since ultimately the decision makers might not either have like the lived experience to sort of like shape their worldview, I'm kind of concerned about that. And as Jane said, it's not necessarily like a discovery statute, but I've had a lot of issues trying to get data across all sorts of things. And so there is this question of infrastructure and what exists. I'm even thinking about, you know, as a public defender, you end up, and I assume as a DA, but I haven't been on that on that side. But like, you know, there's this thing about like what is a case worth, right? Especially like in the misdemeanor context. And I have real questions about like how much data is being kept there in terms of like what is the sort of like general offerings on cases and how those might differ both by the race and ethnicity of the client. I oftentimes felt like, I think I was the first Black male hired in the Contra Costa Public Defender's Office in like a decade, and always the only one on my team. So I used to always feel like my coworkers were getting different offers on cases than I was, and that kind of thing. And I don't necessarily know if we're keeping data for all those offerings that you can then say, well, in this case, my client was offered to settle the case for X days in county jail, and this seems wildly inappropriate, and we have some like baseline to base it on, so a judge doesn't just say, oh, that's just you, again, as James said, trying to inject race into this, when we know that like we don't have to inject race, it's ever present.
Well, at least the act like requires the recognition of data. I mean, there's people like Justice Scalia who said, doesn't matter how much data you have, it shouldn't be a factor in whether or not this is constitutional. So let me ask the question about, that's been mentioned a couple of times, about unconscious bias. And how well do you think that the Racial Justice Act adequately addresses unconscious bias by the various actors in the criminal justice system?
Well, I'm going to piggyback off Brandon here and saying that, you know, just we have seen throughout our history, it is still Black History Month, so shout that out. But we have seen throughout our history that America's history, I'm speaking of, that just because you pass a law, you can go back to many different eras, just because you pass a law doesn't mean you change the intentions, the hearts, and the actions of the people who are responsible for enacting those laws. And so unconscious bias is something that is so personal to people. And I think what is really needed, as I was saying before, is leadership that sets the expectation. Because if, you have the, defense attorney or district attorney who believes what they believe, and there's no expectation for them to examine that, then they may do just enough to, on the surface, appear to be doing the right thing. But there are so many ways in which the system, the integrity of the system gets attacked, and individual people who were before the system don't get a fair shot, that could still be deemed legal and okay, that them not examining that unconscious bias is, it just basically makes the Racial Justice Act an empty law. And so on paper, it looks good, and I'm excited about it. I encourage everyone who has anything to do with it to attend trainings. I'm along with my co-chair for the Public Defenders for Racial Justice we've done multiple trainings already throughout the state on the Racial Justice Act. But it also requires, outside of those trainings, for people to be willing to actually address it. So it adequately addresses it, so insofar as people are doing their own work. I have some hope. I did want to say I have some hope that in these political times, in this age of awakening for some, I think for some of us not awakening, but this awakening for some of anti-Blackness, of systemic racism, of implicit and explicit bias use. I have hope that people will be positioned to at least be open to examining these things. But if that doesn't happen, the Racial Justice Act can never adequately address the unconscious bias of people. It really is an individual act led by the leaders in the various organizations to get them to understand that if you want to be here as a public defender, if you want to be here as a district attorney, if you want to, be handling certain types of cases as a judge, we expect you to do that work. So there need to be trainings, there need to be not just one training on unconscious and unbiased, there need to be ongoing trainings, there need to be ongoing trainings about the Racial Justice Act, there needs to be cultural competency trainings, there need to be a whole host of things, there needs to be meetings and consultation with credible messengers from the community about what their experiences were like. Without all of those different components, it's going to be very hard for the Racial Justice Act to adequately address it.
And the other,
No, go ahead.
the other thing I would like to add too is that there has to be requirements and changes made in terms of how statistics are being gathered. And that work has started in a lot of communities, but more has to be done. Who's being arrested? How are they being arrested? What is the race? What is the background? I remember Brandon mentioned neighborhoods. That information can be gathered, but it has to be, the pressure has to be brought by the communities, by the DAs, by the PDs, by everybody that's involved to make sure that these statistics are not only taken, they're existed, and they're compiled. And this is where you have a lot of ways for people to sort of get out of saying whether or not something happened, because, oh, we don't have the statistics to prove that, or how do you expect us to show that? We have to start at the bottom floor in terms of when these arrests are made, what are the races, who's getting arrested, how is it happening? And all of that is not being done in every single county. So this is not, it's a great act, but there's a lot of work that still must be done.
But that leads to, directly to the criticism of the act, which is about the cost of implementation. I mean, isn't this going to overwhelm the court system and the resources allocated to it?
I would.
Everything is overwhelming, but you have to be willing to do the right thing. And the bottom line is there's always a cost, but there's also a cost on the other end in terms of people losing their lives, people not feeling that the justice system works, people taking the law into their own hands. So you have to weigh it out. And
Well,
if you
Brandon,
want justice, have to put the money there to make sure it happens.
Brandon's really.
I was just gonna say that I mean, I think so everything has a cost. There's always a discussion about the cost and I mean to quote from McCleskey, there's this fear of like too much justice, right? And that can't be an excuse for not doing anything, because the reality is to the last question, there really is not an enforcement mechanism, right? So in places where there's already sort of either legal services or policy groups or other folks organizing around these issues, then you can see where there'll be an infrastructure set up for accountability. But in places where there isn't that, then that lack of accountability is going to be very hard. Sorry, my kids. And another thing that's wanted to note just really quick, and I'll get to the cost. But in terms of this implicit bias question, as I was saying earlier, like there's a lot of things that we already know. Like there was a study, I think from University of Berkeley, that essentially said, what if you're Black and have been pulled over by the police, you already know that the police speak to Black people differently, right? And so like this idea that like we have to go searching for bias, I think is not really the issue. My question is the thing around change behavior. Like I'm less inclined to be interested in someone like doing training just for like awareness and more so like how is there going to be accountability for the change in their behavior. But around the cost, as I said, like all these criminal fines and fees, we know they were disproportionately impacting poor Black and brown communities. And there was always this conversation about, it's going to cost too much money to get rid of those things. But the reality, at least in that particular context, is that the vast majority of those fines and fees were uncollectible because the people who are mostly being pushed into the criminal justice system are poor anyway. So like the cost ended up being a sort of like false argument. And I think in this, if you take this as well as all of the other sort of like racial justice things that were passed in the last year, there is a question of whether or not we as a state are actually committed to what these things say. And if we're committed to them, then we have to put up the resources to implement them, and we have to have some level of enforcement mechanisms, because in the 50 some odd counties in California, it's going to look very, very different in the places again where there's like very active offices, very active people on the ground than like in like a smaller rural county, right? Like who's doing either the data collection there or the enforcement there to actually hold them accountable.
And I think, just throw in here, I think it's very important that we not overlook the fact that Jane mentioned before, this question of race. It's a powder keg. And there are a lot of people that have gone through this world, believe it or not, that are not Black and brown and really have no life experience around racism. If we look back to what happened to George Floyd this summer and seeing that on tape, I had white friends that were like, oh, appalled. And of course, I had Black friends who went, what are you talking about? This kind of stuff happens all the time. So we're going to have to start talking about these issues, putting it out there, and facing the reality that there are people in our community, non-Black folks in our community, that do not understand what it is we've been going through. And that has to be explained. It has to be, back to Jane, the training has to take place. You have to talk about it. I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but I don't believe in unconscious bias. I think it's all conscious. You know what the heck you're doing. The reality is, can you define that bias? Do you understand what it is you're doing? What I used to use as an example when I did hiring in terms of trying to hire others into the office with different racial backgrounds. You bring somebody in and you interview them, and you bring in the person of color and you ask them those questions, and you're done with that interview in 20 minutes. Now you bring in that white student or attorney to be that looks like you, that comes from somewhere you know of, and all of a sudden the interview goes on an hour. That white individual gets the job, and yet you say to yourself, well, I didn't have any bias.
Look, this is a completely different panel that we need to have.
Oh, yes, it is. But I think it all plays in, in terms of what people do and do not know. And the reality is there is a lot of training that has to be done. We cannot just think because we know what racism is and what it looks like that everybody knows.
Well, we only have about 8 minutes left before we have to sign off. And I definitely want to take audience questions, but I think it's really important to ask this one other question, which is the question about people with disabilities. The Disability Rights California, in supporting CRJA, highlighted that persons with disabilities, particularly those who intersect with race and color, are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. And this bias plays a distinct role in how and when a person is charged with a crime and how they pursue their due process rights in courts. So how can we address intersectionality and bias in the criminal justice system with this act?
You just
Well,
have,
it's interesting that you brought that up because in terms of the cost, one of the things that I was going to, if that we don't look at the system as a whole, and that's the problem, tend to section it off. So, you know, anyone who is familiar with the criminal system knows that jails are across the state are filled with people facing mental health challenges.
mhm.
And so, you know, if we were willing to address that fact first, or alongside these other issues, then one, there would be more awareness of the intersectionality of that bias. You know, it's amazing we have an hour to have this discussion because I mean, just think about the fact that someone who, you know, is trying to get OR released on their own recognizance to go home while facing a charge, if they're facing mental health challenges, if they're a person of color and maybe don't have the most stable housing situation, they're going to get kept locked up. And so we have to be willing to identify those areas in terms of people with disabilities and actually see that. I don't think, honestly, it much like race, but far more, people don't even use the language of disability in the courtroom. So that's a starting point. We don't even, people, unless, you know, someone comes in clearly in a, you know, paraplegic state or something along those lines that's super obvious, disabilities are largely unseen and unspoken about in the courtroom. And so again, I think that first step has to be talking openly about it, and then be willing to look at the statistics. The statistics are there and they are clear. And then being willing to address it. And maybe if there was some work with community organizations and others, maybe what would end up happening in at some point is there would be a shift of resources, which would free up these other resources to help people within the criminal system, put the resources where it really needs to go, rather than just housing people with mental health challenges.
The whole mental health issue is just, it's so beyond everything. I had a meeting last week when we discussed this, that Santa Clara County is now looking at issues around having to build a new jail. And of course, you know, with the whole thing that happened in California around mental health and not really having adequate facilities for people. This is another, you know, 5-hour discussion on how we really start to deal with that. And as many of us that are sitting on this panel know, there are many, many mental health issues among poor and Black and brown people that are just plain not recognized and not taken into account.
And certainly the COVID crisis is just making that even more apparent and worse. Brandon, did you want to address this?
I mean, the only thing that I was gonna, add, I think everybody else already, you know, answered the question probably as completely as I could. But I really think that, you know, all of these questions um, sort of just get at the thing that, you know, the act doesn't do, but hopefully opens up a question, like opens up opportunity to have the discussion, which is, you know, what is it? Like what is it that we think that the criminal justice system uh, solves? Like what is the underlying purpose of it, and is it functioning towards that end, right? Like if, you know, right now you have a bunch of sweeps and other things happening with unhoused populations all around California. Mental health is a huge issue there, right? Oftentimes my clients in Contra Costa County were unhoused and getting charged for, you know, having a knife that they used to open up cans or like insert thing, right? And um uh obviously like involvement in the criminal justice system is not getting them housing, stable environment, stable jobs, etc. So I think, you know, I say all that to say that like in terms of intersectionality, right? You add black on any other identity, like the outcomes usually go down, right? And but knowing that there is this question about that I hope we eventually get to, like, is what is the actual means for achieving justice and safety for communities, and whether or not this is like the appropriate avenue for doing so. I mean, I mentioned that the other bills, but the voting bill, right, that extended the franchise to individuals with felonies. You know, the data from that said that at any given time, 30% of black men in California are denied the franchise of voting, right? And even that bill, you know, from my vantage point, didn't go far enough because it made it so you can't vote if you're on parole or probation. But I just say all this to say, like, that is also poses this question of like, what is the means that the criminal justice system is seeking to effectuate, right? If like the system is responsible for denying 30% of a population of people from being able to vote, like we probably should be questioning it, right? Like if we already know that the vast majority of people are black, and when you add intersectionality, that is a lot of folks suffering from mental health and trauma and other things, like is the criminal justice system in any way going to be able to like change or disrupt any of that? And I hope the data and around the things that we already know, and maybe some of the things that we will soon learn, will help us really to interrogate that question.
Well, thank you. I've been a bad moderator with a great panel. We have 1 minute left and don't really have time for questions, but there is a question about how can we get more DAs and other officials elected who will be instrumental in really implementing these policies that are expressed in the act.
Well, I think bottom line is it's up to each and every one of us to make sure that we get those folks that we recognize can make these changes in those positions of power. And it's easier said than done, but certainly I have done it over time. And when I'm asked to support folks and put my name down there in black and white in newspaper that I support someone for DA or for judge or for whomever, I have to make sure that they're talking about the ideals that I believe in. And we have to believe in our own power, and we have to exercise it.
I would just really say get involved in your local politics. If you people do, I'm shocked often, maybe I shouldn't say shocked, but I'm surprised that people really, unless they're in the system, don't understand the importance of their local, of the sheriff and of the police department heads and of the district attorney. And if you get involved, you go to their web pages, you show up at events, write letters, call, that matters to them because they know they need votes.
That's
And
right.
so we, as just like, there's just, we have a new president, vice president. It's our job to hold our elected people or those we want to elect accountable, period. And so get involved and hold them accountable. And if they're not doing it, get them out of there.
Mhm.
And
Let me
I would
think-
only thing I would add is like it has to be connected to like a broader civic engagement, voter registration thing, because I said this in the chat, but you already see the huge backlash that's happening with Chaser right now in San Francisco, that's happening with Gascon in LA. So it's not just about getting people to run, but it's also about like anticipating what the backlash is and knowing that you've been doing all the civic engagement, community involvement, and voter registration to ensure that people can be there long enough to actually be to make some change, because the backlash is inevitable every single time. So it's not just the candidate, but it's like, what is the infrastructure that we're building around them? So it's what is the movement that looks like that surrounds the candidate, that I would say.
But the beauty of it all is that people are stepping out there and they are stepping up. And we just have to keep that impetus going. And for the law students out there, get ready to take on the charge.
Well, let me thank everybody for an incredible panel. Jane, Brandon, and Rolanda, as usual. We just thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Sorry we didn't have enough time, but hopefully you got enough. Thank you. And
Thank
nice
you.
meeting all of you.
Thanks, Professor Armstrong, and thank you so much, panelists. This was such a great event. I just wanted to quickly come on and thank our audience and announce the winners for the raffle. It is Eric Marshall and Sarah May Sanchez. Please look out for an email within the next hour for your gift cards. Thank you so much, everyone.
I was hoping it was
Also-
me. Thank you, everybody.
I never
One
win
final-
anything.
One final note, in case you're interested in learning more about the Racial Justice Act, you can join the Northern California Innocence Project next week on March 4th from 4 to 5 p.m. To see a panel about that. And you can find out more information on their Facebook page and social media pages, the Northern California Innocence Project. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
you.
All right, I'm leaving.
Great seeing you. Bye.
Bye-bye. You like my pink